I suppose what I want to do is to argue for fiscal expansion and to argue for stimulus. But I'm very aware of the dangers of doing that without it being put in the context of an alternative agenda. And I take very seriously that John Barry's argument this morning about the dangers of growth for growth's sake and the danger of pumping up an economy, pumping up consumerism and pumping up the present business as usual model that people are very keen to get back to. So there is a danger of talking about more growth and re-stimulating growth without a new model of development. And that, for that reason, I want to really emphasise the importance of politics and the need for that new standpoint. So I want to start off with that because I might not get to it at the end. And there is, and I think this morning was very much about this, trying to build up a clear narrative for an alternative model of development and a clear narrative that there is a different way of doing something and it should be possible to win a domestic coalition of political actors towards working together for that new model and to win that battle of ideas that we should be entering into at the moment. And I think that's very important because what Vinton was talking about in particular was the need to start this discussion with a debate about the political system and the impact of the political system on how we debate policy in Ireland and on how we construct the choices that we think are available to us in Ireland. So if we wanted to focus on the longer term aim and having a longer term vision, and we're looking at the kind of leadership that's able to come through our institutions at the moment, we can see a crisis of our political institutions and indeed a crisis of our academic institutions to a large degree as well, I think. So institutional reform and political reform has to be part of the picture, I think, when we're talking about this debate. And I suppose just a simple model for thinking about how change happens is you do get coalitions of interest groups. They do take ideas, they work them through institutions, and people win the battle in the institutions then, whether it's electoral institutions or social partnership institutions or parliamentary institutions. Now, one thing I would say to us today as a coalition of people here in the name of a progressive economy is where are we in this whole map? Where are our interests and our coalitions? What type of ideas are we trying to promote? And where are the institutional spaces that we're trying to sell our ideas? I think probably we need to do a lot of work as our own coalition of interests to be better effective at winning this battle of ideas. And I think in that, again, John Barry described the ecological economists and the feminist economists and the Marxist economists and the whole range of alternative economists. And I suppose my starting point would be that we don't talk to each other enough and we don't constellate our own ideas enough in order to build up a narrative about a possible alternative. And I really welcome today for that reason, because I think it is a very clear intent in bringing together a range of actors from different but progressive economic perspectives and trying to arrange a coalition that might be more effective at taking on board that battle for ideas. So that's a starting point in terms of where to enter the thing. And I suppose where I'm coming into that battle of ideas is that idea of that we do need a new Irish model of development, that it is possible to imagine a new Irish model of development. And I suppose I was quite intrigued of what would the economy look like if it was designed by a scientist or it was designed by an ecologist. I suppose I'm primarily interested in what would it look like if it was designed by a woman, or what would it look like if it was designed by a poor woman or by a working class community. What kind of models would democracy throw up if we really had democracy that worked in terms of everybody's interests being represented at the plinth. And I've been involved in 2 civil society processes that tried to do just that, tried to imagine a different Ireland and what the constituent parts of it might look like. One was A Better Ireland is Possible with Community Platform, a range of national organisations involved in equality and anti-poverty and community development. And the second was a process known as Isféidirlinn, inspired by the optimism and the progressive agenda that Obama was bringing out in 2008, who worked together to produce a manifesto or an alternative vision of development, which sought at the heart of it to have balance and to bring together a sustainable, environmentally sustainable and productive economy, redistributive justice in terms of income and tax policy, a focus on the importance of services in people's lives, particularly quality services, an importance on the focus of equality underpinning the delivery of those services, and then above all, the need to have a reform of our democratic and participative institutions, because without that, as Fintan was saying, you won't enable the other strands of a progressive model to come out and to constellate together. So that's sort of, I suppose, our contribution to the beginnings, I hope, of a much more intense dialogue from us about putting together an alternative that can win a political agenda about reform. And now I'm going to move into the more micro argument, if you like, about that deflation versus expansionary argument. And I suppose in terms of where I'm coming from, also as a spokesperson for the Poor Can't Pay Coalition, which is, again, a coalition of community and anti-poverty groups and trade unions arguing against cuts in social welfare and against cuts in the minimum wage. And I suppose the science bit is that, like, if you look at deflationary figures, it would suggest 6.5% was the headline figure yesterday. But the science suggests that inflation impacts hugely differently on the poor. They have a different basket of weekly goods. There hasn't been deflation of much of that basket of weekly goods. The degree to which mortgages impact on deflation is not relevant to most poor households. They have very restricted choices when it comes to where they shop, and monopolies in local communities don't always pass on the impact of deflationary prices to poorer communities. There's still, even if they did, there's still a gap between the weekly income they have and what they need to have an adequate life. So they need more welfare and not less, even in the context of deflation. Secondary, deflation obviously would have a deflationary impact on economic development itself. The poor don't save, they spend all their money, it goes straight back into the economy. It's well known. Cutting the incomes of the poorest would deflate the economy. But most important of all to me, I think, is that deflation, as it's been thrown at us as an excuse for pushing out an agenda for welfare cuts and for wages cuts, is to some degree an ideological smokescreen, I believe. I've pointed out three wise men here, but I'm sure there's plenty more. Michael Casey, formerly of the IMF, Tom O'Connell, Central Bank the other day, and Colin McCarthy, who all have been not just using deflation as an argument to cut welfare. They have then been going a lot further and arguing it should never have been that high to begin with. Let's get it down. Let's keep it down. So there's a lot more going on than simply a technical argument about deflation, meaning that there's a technical necessity for welfare to be cut this year or next year. These guys are very intent on, once it gets cut, it doesn't go back up again. They're very intent on locking back into that Anglo-Saxon neoliberal kind of welfare model. So there's a lot going on in that deflation debate that's very ideological about where the interests of the poor lie. Sorry. There's also a lot of what Stiglitz called deficit fetishism, which I really liked. And that there's a lot of brainwashing going on, a lot of common sense arguments coming out from the neoclassical economists about we can't afford not to. We can't afford not to because the cost of paying for extra borrowing would be so high. We can't afford not to because it would increase the problem. We can't afford not to because there would be a lot of leakage from a fiscal stimulus out of the economy. Now, the main leakage I think a lot of people will be thinking about in education is leakage from classroom roofs, which is a perennial problem in a lot of our primary schools, secondary schools, and even our universities, as someone Maynooth would testify. The arguments about leakage can, I think, be thrown away. There are so many sectors of the economy, like school building, like care industries, like tourism, like agriculture, that don't leak out. There's lots of areas where we could do fiscal stimulus without getting into the dangers of leakage. Then there's also then the arguments about what we have the Growth and Stability Pact. We have a deal with the EU. We've guaranteed we get it down in 4 years. It's not worrying the French. It's not worrying them when they're negotiating on NAMA, and it's not worrying the UK outside of the Growth and Stability Pact. So all of the arguments, I think, the common sense arguments that we have no choice here, we can't afford or we're not allowed to have a stimulus, aren't on the agenda as far as I'm concerned. They're in reverse actually, aren't they? The truth is that we can't afford not to have a stimulus, in my opinion. And to some degree, they throw out their own argument with NAMA by showing that if there's a good enough argument for borrowing more, then you should do it. Now, I don't agree with NAMA. I don't think it's a good enough argument for borrowing more. But the logic that they prove is, if you can prove there's an argument for borrowing, you are justified in borrowing more. And I think we can prove that there's an argument for borrowing for economic stimulus. One, because the long-term cost of not doing so is great. Tony Gagan in Merchants Quay was showing the other day how for every €1 we put in this year, into drug prevention strategies, we will save €3 immediately in relation to preventing, intervening in cost-related things of drug addiction. We know that if we can get job creation going again, it will generate revenue. So we're building up the economy. And as people said earlier on, both McCarthy and the Commission on Taxation identified domestic indigenous resources that we have available to us now without borrowing that could be used for a fiscal stimulus. So there's lots of arguments that enable fiscal stimulus to be a common sense, viable alternative that government are simply politically choosing not to look at because of an ideological orientation, and because of this deficit fetish. Okay. And I think a lot of that is about the poverty of ambition that we see in Ireland. Most countries know that welfare reform is a key part of welfare adjustment. We use welfare adjustment, we use stimulus to tackle. The prudent course of action is usually in countries to review and redesign your social welfare systems, not slash and burn them. And I have that from Niamh Hardiman. So it seems a logical thing that any country that's wanting to get itself out of this mess would be looking at what they can do with their welfare system, not simply looking at how they can cut it, but looking to reimagine how they could use welfare to restart the economy. And I think, just want to go on there to finish on this, I think that there are very imaginative ways that we can get at what Fintan O'Toole was describing that as security. We know that people are fearful for their security at the moment. There are ways that we can package our welfare system and our labour market systems. We can fund it through a fiscal stimulus around three things: secure and adequate incomes, active social policy, and job creation, sustainable job creations. Part of that could be things like universal pensions, creative use of, active use of income supports, and service economy kind of jobs. I think if people could see a package that could be created from a fiscal stimulus that made sense to them in showing them how it could help them be more secure over the next 10 to 20 years as the economy continues to rock globally, that they would buy the taxation and the economic package that's necessary to do it. And I think in that sense, we can see our welfare state, our three legs of income, public services and the labour market as a very shoddy old welfare state at the moment. I think fiscal stimulus gives us an opportunity to redesign our welfare supports in the context of some of what TASC spoke about in the development of welfare state and in the context of flexicurity, into a much more streamlined, useful, efficient, productive and socially fair, sustainable welfare system that can support a mobile and adaptable economy. And I think if we could put together that narrative ourselves, that would work for us. So just to finish, I suppose, going back to the start, because it is all about politics and it is all about trying to get coalitions of people. Some people will argue more for an ecological package as a fiscal stimulus. I've argued here for a welfare reform package for a fiscal stimulus. And my point is, I think we need a model of development to fit our different packages together so that they can complement each other and make sense to each other, and in that way create that broad political coalition for change that's only emerging at the moment, I would feel. So I'll leave you with that idea. Thank you.